Good morning. I am Sergio Saya from the University of Pisa, and this is a lesson of the massive open online course of the SHARInGMeD project, a research and innovation action on the soil health and agricultural resilience in the Mediterranean area, funded by the Partnership for Research and Innovation in the Mediterranean area. In this lesson, we will deal with the relationship between sustainability and productivity in agriculture. I would like to clarify that this lesson is being performed by the SHARInGMeD project, also in collaboration with the Subsoil project, another European initiative funded by the Horizon Mission Soil, dealing with the sustainable soil and subsoil health promotion by implementing agroecological land use and management to enhance ecosystem services delivery for the society. Both this project and other activities have also created the Living Lab AgroSalute. Firstly, when we want to talk about the productivity, we have to take into account that in agriculture we apply a number of production factors. All of these production factors can also produce either visible or hidden food losses and food wastes along the whole value chain. These include both the agricultural production and also the use of the food. Regarding this aspect, the Food and Agriculture Organization has also promoted a campaign to reduce and hopefully stop the food loss and food waste in order to improve the food availability for the humankind and reduce the environmental impact of both the agriculture and the whole food sector. In this topic, we must take into account that one of the losses along the whole value chain is already achieved within the agricultural phase. In particular, crops have a given yield. That yield is also called actual yield or real yield, but this yield could be even higher if we could use properly the land and all the production factor up to at least an attainable yield. And in particular situation, we can also reach the maximum achievable yield that is called the potential yield. To do so, we have to take into account that one of the production factor is the land use, and land is used per unit area and also in terms of resources into the soil. And this can produce a direct effect on the sustainability of the system. In this lesson, I will mostly focus on the sustainability for the agricultural stage. When doing so, we can also take into account that the agricultural stage does not simply have agronomic outcomes, for example, in terms of yield, but also economic outcomes, and these outcomes also have social implications. Lastly, the whole of these aspects can also have strong implication from the environmental point of view, and we should aim to increase the yield while reducing the impact. This is the Food and Agricultural Organization concept of sustainable intensification. That is not an easy task and cannot be achieved in any condition, but that can be a good aim. Among the production factor, indeed, we have in agriculture a number of production factors. One of these, for example, is the use of the raw materials, just like seed, and indeed the genotypes that we bring with the seed as a special traits. So we can say that we use genes, we use fertilizers, pesticides. When we are rearing livestock, we can also use feedstock, and in any condition we use machineries and buildings, fuel, and so on. Another particular topic of the production factor is water. The very most of the water applied in agriculture is used by the crops for the transpiration, but it's not directly retained by the plant. but this process can have a profound effect on the quality of the water and also on the environmental quality. There are other production factors that cannot be ignored, for example, the working time and their cost, the fund used for the production, and especially the knowledge and technology used in the agricultural stage. Regarding to soil, as I mentioned before, we have to carefully take into account that we are not simply using an area. The unit area in agriculture is usually the hectare, so 10,000 square meter. But we are only using the mass of the soil that is into that area. This is because in that mass of the soil we have organic and mineral nutrients, and both the organic and the mineral nutrients can go under particular processes of transformation, part of which can also be from the one time beneficial for the crops as nutrient for the plants, and a part of this can also be lost. Also, the conditions of this mass of soil determine its quality, and one of the recent topics frequently applied at a European and, as I would like to say, also at a global level is the concept of soil health. So, soil is the cornerstone of life. This is because the biodiversity into the soil can be a definitely high fraction of the whole biodiversity in the world. Indeed, studying the biodiversity in the soil is not easy, and various reports suggest that compared to the total biodiversity of the world, the one stored into the soil may span between the 20-25% up to the 70%. So probably we are missing the very most of the biodiversity into the soil. That is an important fraction of the biodiversity at a global extent. Also, the soils sustain the plant growth, and plant growth is the primary source of the food production. This also occurs for the livestock, since livestock needs plants to eat and grow, thus the forage species. Lastly, the soil can filtrate the water and purify it from pollution. And let's not forget that soil is an enormous carbon storage, more than the double of the one into the living plant, and also even higher than the carbon into the atmosphere. So if we increase the amount of carbon into the soil, we are reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And this can be done through the use of the photosynthesis of the plant that take the CO2 from the atmosphere and put it into the soil in terms of root, basically. There is an important issue frequently neglected with the soil health, that the main principle to maintain soil health is maintaining the soil where is it. Unfortunately, the soil can move through various processes, and this movement can occur through erosion. Frequently, one of the main causes of erosion is water erosion. So when the rainfall reaches the soil, it detaches a small fragment of soil that we call sediments, and these sediments are transported along the soil through the rivers and discharged in the rivers and ultimately into the sea. But we have to consider that despite this is a natural process, anthropic processes, just like the agriculture, has dramatically increased this amount of erosion, and in increasing it have reduced the amount of soil into each unit area of soil. There are a number of reports of soil erosion, for example, for the Mediterranean area, Various reports, as the one that I am showing here, indicates that we can have severe amount of erosion if we measure it as a ton of dry soil removed per year per hectare of area. Many areas can lose more than 10 or even 20 tons of soil per hectare. And this is an enormous amount of soil. We have to consider that in this removal, when we remove the soil, we remove the best soil. This is because the most of the soil organic carbon, which is the main trait to stimulate the soil fertility and is responsible of a number of properties into the soil, is the upper layer. In that upper layer, we not simply have the most of the soil organic carbon, but we also have the most of beneficial microbes, the most of the biological activity. When removing day by day and years by years few kilograms of soil per day or per hour, we reach more than 10 or even 20 or 30 or even more than 60 tons of soil per hectares removed in a whole year. And year by year, the soil get thinner. Indeed, the deep horizon are relatively protected, but they are less fertile than the shallow part of the soil. Thus, we remove the most fertile soil, which is also richer in nutrient, and we reduce the productivity of the crop because they will have less nutrient available. There are other outcomes of the management of the soil erosion that have a direct implication on the productivity, and one of these is that in conventional systems we also apply mineral fertilizers. We can also apply synthetic active ingredients as pesticides, for example, fungicides, insecticides. We can also apply herbicides. And when we stimulate the erosion through our processes, these active ingredients or these mineral fertilizers can reach the fresh waters and can produce an environmental damage. So, which are the main agronomic factors, the main management factors stimulating the erosion? How can we stop it? There is a number of management aspects that can indeed be taken into account, but two of these are the most important at all, and the both of them taken together are responsible for more than 90-95% of the erosion produced by the anthropic management. Indeed, there will always be a small part of natural erosion that is needed indeed for the environmental process, but the problem is not having an excess of erosion. These two management factors are, in short, tillage and soil cover. Tillage loosens the soil, it reduces the soil ability to resist to erosion, and as you can see from these data, which are similar to many other data produced at a global extent in a number of different conditions, the conventional tillage systems compared to the reduced tillage systems, or even better if compared to the no tillage systems, dramatically increases erosion. So when we reduce tillage and hopefully avoid it completely, we will dramatically reduce erosion. That's the hot point of the tillage operation. Also, tillage nowadays has a very high cost. It may reach from 30 to even 60% of the total cost in a crop, depending on the area and especially the aridity of this area. So reducing tillage frequently is also accompanied by an increase in the farmer's profit. In many areas of the world, the no-tillage systems have been applied efficiently, for example, in both the Americas, in many areas of the Southeastern Africa, Asia. But in Europe and in some parts of Africa, they are not being applied, or their application is at a low rate. We can argue why. This is because the reduced and especially the no-tillage systems are more complex than the systems that include tillage. Tillage indeed provide some agronomic benefit. One of these is that it helps in the control of the weed and the pathogens. And if we don't have any other ways to control for these stressors for the plant, we will mostly be obliged to make tillage, but tillage will stimulate erosion at the one time. At the one time, indeed, tillage can help in incorporating some materials into the soil. For example, if we add organic fertilizers through tillage operation, we can improve the reach of this organic fertilizer in deeper layer. So we must study the trade-off between the sustainability and the agronomic benefits of the tillage. Frequently, if the no tillage and the reduced tillage systems are not applied properly, they can also produce a reduced yield. The reduction of yield in the no tillage system compared to the with tillage systems depends on many conditions, and one of the most important is the water availability. The lower the water availability, the higher the benefit of the no tillage. In areas with severe drought, no tillage can even produce a higher yield, and in any case, it produces a reduced production cost. This data has been studied in a very high amount of different crops and different areas, not simply in 3 crops, just like the almond, or in field crops, just like wheat, but in many other crops, and all of them yield similar results. We have also to consider that there is another important trait to reduce the erosion, and this is the vegetation cover. When the rainfall hits the soil, it starts flowing on the soil, and one of the main problems of the rainfall ability to erode, which is called the erosivity factor, is that it may reach a soil that has no protection from any vegetation cover. So increasing the vegetation cover will protect the soil through a number of different means. For example, it also slows down the water movement in the runoff and directly protect the soil, and also the roots will tighten the soil. Indeed, the reduced tillage, and especially the no tillage, can be efficiently coupled with the soil cover with vegetation, whereas in the tillage operation we frequently destroy the above ground vegetation. Indeed, the amount of soil that is lost in a covered condition compared to a nude condition may be variable depending on the various rainfall, type of soil, type of crop, length in time of the soil vegetation cover, and especially the percentage of extent of the vegetation cover. Thus, let's consider that these two traits, so soil cover through vegetation, either living or, when it's not possible, also with non-living vegetation, for example, plant residues, and reduction of tillage intensity with special emphasis to the no-tillage, make the main principle of the conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture is indeed the cornerstone of the regenerative system, that at the one time the regenerative system is the core of the agroecology. In nature, tillage doesn't exist, and soil is almost permanently covered. Indeed, in agriculture, we don't simply have to imitate nature. We have to take into account of the natural effect to improve the yield and the profit. Agriculture is not nature, is made for the man, for the humankind. Well, we now have a good view of the effect of many production factors and their effect in the crop production. For example, tillage operation, which can indeed improve the management of the weed, and some other factors that were not clearly clarified, but that are quite common. For example, fertilizer application increases directly the yield by providing the nutrients for the crop, and pesticides and herbicides and fungicides at all remove some biotic stresses that are harming to the soil. And when we use all these production factors, we have a given yield. That yield may indeed vary by condition to condition. For example, in limiting conditions of bad weather events, bad climate, bad soil, we have a low actual yield. When indeed conditions are improved a little bit, we can have suboptimal conditions and a higher actual yield. And when the conditions are optimal, the actual yield is higher. So far, the use of all these production factors depends on the ability of the farmers. So usually the farmer could attain a higher yield while using the same production factor. If properly used, these can provide the attainable yield. So in any condition, we can have a higher yield if we avoid to have a mismatch between the correct management and the actual management of the production factor. So actually, this blue part in the slides is a food loss, since we could have it simply using what we already have in a better way. Indeed, if we would be able also to cover some strongly limiting factors, let's say some insurmountable limitations, for example, the ability of the crop, the genetic ability of the crop to use this production factor, or some environmental conditions which are not easy to be managed, for example, the temperature in field crops. So we can also reach the potential yield. So at least we should aim to achieve the attainable yield and cover the gap between actual and attainable yield. In doing so, we must consider indeed the actual growth conditions into the farmers and their knowledge and availability of technology about their system. If we could help directly the farmers in better using what they already have, in better managing both their plots and their whole environment, we will improve the yield and reach a closer level to the attainable yield. So actually, potential yield is not really achievable with some rare exception, but it can be an aim that we can have. And we are mostly interested in covering the gap between attainable and actual yield. So the matter is now the big question: what does it take to reduce such gap? There is an enormous amount of management practices needed to reduce the gap, and presently we don't have a clear view of the attainable yield, but indeed we have a clear view of the potential yield, and we can compute indeed the gap between potential and actual. And we can see that one of the most important aspects in the yield is having a sufficient amount of water for the crop. For example, the no-tillage system increase the amount of water available for the crop. There are indeed other yield gap that can be devoted to the amount of nutrient into the soil, and we should deliver that timely with the crop needs, or the kind of soil and so on, or the technology available for the farmers. In any case, all this yield gap has been tightly related to the yield loss. So the higher the yield gap, the higher the yield loss, and all of these are strongly related to the removal of soil through tillage operation and any other counterbacks produced by tillage. Indeed, some management factors, just like fertilization, can affect this variation. This is because fertilization indeed helps the plant, and the help to the plant is higher under suboptimal or poor conditions. There are other examples that we must take into account. One of these is the management of the rotation. For example, in continuous no-tillage and conventional tillage systems, when these systems were under rotation, there has not been a difference between no-tillage and conventional, whereas in the systems with self-succeeding crops, just like the gray circles I'm showing there, year by year there has been a reduction of the yield in the no-tillage if compared to the conventional tillage. This has occurred because indeed rotation helps in the management of the pest and weeds, and since tillage help in the management of the weeds and the pest, when we don't have tillage, we should try to implement these systems also with other systems, and the rotation is one of the most efficiency. So we came on the third principle of the conservation system, that is indeed including also rotations. We must also consider that when trying to protect the soil by reducing the tillage, for example with the no-tillage system that we show there in red, we also have a reduced mineralization, and the reduced mineralization will consist in a reduced amount of nutrients for the crops. So we should consider applying more fertilizers in order to build better the crop productivity for at least some years, after which this productivity will be built based on newly formed soil organic carbon that will directly feed the crop. There are indeed other important hints in the sustainability of the crops and the crop management. One of these is the application of organic fertilizer, but the very most of the organic fertilizers are manure, and manure can be produced only if we have livestock. In turn, the presence of the livestock will provide also more availability to have different crops in the rotation. This is because we can add in the rotation also the forage crops. And lastly, we should indeed try to increase the circularity of the system on its wall, trying to reduce the own resources. So when we come to the input and all the management factors that I have detailed are inputs in agriculture, we should consider that we have a given yield with some given input, and these inputs may produce an environmental impact. So which is the relationship between yield and the environmental impact? Well, simply we should compute through life cycle assessment or other processes the environmental impact per unit area, but we must also consider the yield obtained by that area. At the end, we will come out with a unit yield per unit impact. What if we better manage the agriculture through reduced tillage techniques or no tillage, increased circularity, more rotations, use of better genotypes including genetically modified crops and so on, and we achieve a higher yield? Well, we can achieve the same yield from a lower area, so we can spare land and we can use that land to improve the environment. We must consider that at that time we will have indeed a higher impact per unit area, because frequently this is accompanied by an intensification of the crop production. And intensification frequently means more impact per unit area. At one time, we can have indeed the benefits of growing some natural stand in the area spared. In every condition, we must consider if increasing the intensification of the cultivation increases more or less the yield. So, per every unit increase in the impact, do we have more than one unit increase of the yield or less? This relationship is very complex, can be indeed very variable from condition to conditions, and should be studied in local conditions. In these conditions, we have to take into account also of the social aspects. This is because using new technologies that are very promising and then that can indeed provide a number of benefits, just like, for example, the biochar, which is an organic fertilizers, or the manure, which requires also to have the livestock, or the genetically modified crops may not be accepted by the population. And this lack of acceptance may be due both due to economic constraints or to legal constraints or other social constraints. So the yield gap is a main cause of food loss, and it's not a non-harvested production. The non-harvested production is that production that we obtain but that we do not collect for a number of reasons, frequently economic reasons. The yield gap has never been obtained, but it could have been obtained with a better use of the soil resources and all the inputs in agriculture. A high yield gap implies that from an economic point of view, we are not properly using the inputs. So we are obtaining less with more inputs. And at the one time, the inputs produce an environmental impact. So reducing the yield gap will also increase the sustainability while reducing the environmental impact. One of the resources that we will improve is the use of the soil, and improving this efficiency will allow us to use less soil and spare the soil for other natural uses which are indeed needed. And lastly, we cannot forget that some of the tools that we use come from foreign countries, so increasing the production, increasing the sustainable production, and reducing the yield gap can also be accompanied by a reduction of dependence from foreign countries. So a high yield gap is also a policy problem. While sparing land through an increasing yield, we can also promote biodiversity. This is because the main actor in the reduction of the biodiversity is the conversion of the ecosystem from natural to anthropic uses, including the agricultural use. Thus, at least in Mediterranean areas, the yield gap may be very high, up to 20 or 30%. This means that we can increase dramatically the food availability and reduce the food cost while increasing at the one time the profit for the farmer, reducing the yield gap. And this has been seen in a number of different conditions. And as you can see here, the agricultural losses can be very important if compared to the rest of the food losses. What does it take to reduce this yield gap, to improve yield, and to have a sustainable intensification? In short, it takes that a number of factors should be included in this process. One of these are governance driven. Some other one include also the scientific research. Among the governance driven factor, well, indeed, we need more science, more research, more experimentation, more technology transfer, and this should be indeed supported by the governance. We should also avoid to limit the technology development. It has been viewed since the last 30 or 50 years that technology improves sustainability. For example, the precision agricultural technique, the conservative or regenerative systems, the use of the breeding techniques to have genetically modified crop, or the new breeding techniques and so on, the microbial technology that is being used by many farmers to improve the yield, including in organic agriculture, the use of newly made synthetic or also natural active ingredient, and all of these indeed must have demonstrated safe and efficiency. And indeed, the governance should also contribute to the technology farmers, from the science to the farmers and the whole value chain. At the one end, we should also increase the diversity of the study conditions. This is because agriculture is strongly variable depending on the area, depending on the economic aspect of the area, and so on. And this should be done in a collaboration between farmers from the one side and all the other stakeholders in the value chains. These stakeholders include indeed the policymakers, the other entrepreneur, the production, the producers of input, also the entrepreneurs that transform the agricultural goods, and so on. We have, for example, the Living Lab AgroSalute funded within the Subsoil project that is being supported by the SHARInGMeD project, that is making this kind of activity, and the European community is supporting a number of different living labs in various topics, not simply in the topic of the agriculture, but also indeed in many other topics. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I would like to ask you to follow us in the SHARInGMeD activities. And if you are interested, you can also indeed contact us to follow the AgroSalute activities. AgroSalute is a public living lab on the agroecological and sustainable agriculture, the inclusion of livestock, and the study and management of both agriculture, livestock, urban, and the whole terrestrial ecosystems. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Follow us in SHARInGMeD and AgroSalute.